When I first came to the United States, I was 20 years old and working as an au pair. I didn't have much experience, but I was eager, also very nervous. I'd grown up in a small town in France and hadn't ever spent time away from home, let alone across an ocean. My English still needed work, but I was confident enough to get by. I expected it to be a good year, a new adventure, a cultural exchange, something I'd tell my friends about when I went home. I was matched with the Joseph family. I don't want to name the exact town for privacy reasons, but it was an upper-middle-class neighborhood. Quiet streets, nice houses, big backyards, the kind of place you'd expect to find well-behaved kids, PTA moms, and dads who works non-stop. I remember being so relieved when I first arrived. I thought this would be easy. Nothing bad happens in places like this. The Josephs had 2 boys, Brock and Brandon. Brock, the older one, was 12. He was a pretty typical kid, kind of lazy, sometimes rude, but harmless overall. He made jokes, liked his Xbox, and mostly stayed out of trouble. Brandon, though, was different. He was 9 and already had this coldness to him. I don't know how else to describe it. There was something off. I think it's likely he had some kind of social disorder. When I first met him, he just stared at me without saying a word. Not shy or embarrassed, just staring like he was studying me. After a few seconds, he smiled and asked, "Are you the maid?" I laughed awkwardly and said I was going to help look after him and his brother for the year. He didn't laugh with me, he just kept watching. It didn't take long to realize Brandon wasn't like the other kids. My host parents warned me that he was difficult. They said he had a bit of an attitude, but that was the understatement of the century. Brandon didn't just have an attitude, he was mean. And I don't mean the usual bratty stuff like teasing his brother or refusing to eat what he was served. It was worse than that. He lied constantly, about everything. He once told his teacher that Brock tried to choke him in the kitchen, which never happened. He told the neighbor that his parents locked him in a closet at night. He even told me that the last au pair ran away because of him, and that she was never seen again. When I tried to scold him for it, he narrowed his eyes and said, "Don't tell me what to do." Everything was manageable for me, even at that point, but I do admit that I was a little frightened of him. Things only got worse from there. One night, about 2 months in, I pulled back my sheets and froze. There were thumbtacks scattered all over my mattress. I just stared for a second. Dozens, maybe 100 of them, were pointing upwards, waiting for me to lie down. My heart started racing. The mattress cover had tiny punctures everywhere. I stood there in fear, realizing how close I'd come to lying on them. Brandon had been spying on me earlier that day. I'd caught him peeking through a crack in the door when I was folding clothes. I didn't think much of it at the time, just assumed he was being nosy. But after seeing all those thumbtacks, I wasn't so sure. I was honestly so scared. I didn't want to tell his parents, afraid that they'd send me back to France. So I cleaned up the mess and kept it to myself. After that, things became more and more strange. Brandon started following me around the house. I'd catch him peeking around corners, watching me from the doorways. Sometimes when I was cooking or reading, I'd look up to find him sitting across the room, staring without blinking. I never said anything. I must admit, I tried to avoid him as much as I could out of fear. One afternoon, I was watering flowers in the garden when I smelled something off. A sharp, sour odor, like something rotting. I traced it to a corner of the yard where the soil looked freshly disturbed. I was curious, so I grabbed one of those little garden shovels and started poking at the soil. When I saw what was there, I nearly screamed. There were 3 dead rabbits buried there. Their bodies were twisted and cut in several places. One had its legs tied together with string. I ran inside to tell my host parents. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph looked concerned at first, until they pulled Brendan aside to ask him about it. He gave an innocent look and said it wasn't him. And that was it. They believed him. Mrs. Joseph said it was probably one of the neighborhood kids and told Brendan to go back inside. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked after that. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow near my bed. It was Brandon. He was standing there holding something. I blinked a few times and realized what it was. A kitchen knife. I screamed as loud as I could. By the time the parents came rushing in, the knife was gone. Brandon had shoved it onto the bed. He convinced them that he'd been sleepwalking. Mrs. Joseph gave me an annoyed look, as if to say, "Why are you making such a fuss?" I pointed to the knife handle sticking out from under the bed and pleaded with them to believe me. Mr. Joseph knelt down, pulled it out, and showed it to Brandon. He just smiled and said he had never seen it before, and they of course believed him. I told them that my door had been locked, so he must have picked it, but they told me that was nonsense. I felt so alone. I had no one. I didn't know what to do. For better or worse, a decision was made for me. The next morning, Mrs. Joseph called me to the living room and said I had stolen her jewelry. I was completely confused until she held up a pearl necklace I had never seen before. She told me she had found it in my purse, which she was holding in her other hand. I begged her to believe me, that I hadn't stolen it, but there was nothing I could say to convince her. Brandon stood in the hallway smiling to himself. I knew it was him. They fired me on the spot. I flew back to France the next day. I couldn't believe how easily Brandon had destroyed my life. For months afterwards, I was extremely depressed. I thought I had blown my one chance at living in the US, and feared I wouldn't get another one. Fortunately, I found my way back to the States several years later, and still live here. I have a good job and good friends. I still think about Brandon from time to time. I can only imagine the evil person he's grown up to become. This happened a few years ago. I've always wanted to live in Europe, ever since I was a kid. It was my lifelong dream. More than anything, though, I wanted to work with kids. I've always had a way with them, and I knew ever since I was little that I wouldn't be fully content with my life if my job didn't involve caring for or teaching kids in some capacity. So when I found out I could become an au pair in France, where I could use my French from high school and be part of a family, it felt like everything was falling into place. The decision wasn't easy. I'm from Canada, and the move was a big one, but France had favorable visa options for Canadians, and it was the perfect chance to improve my French, Canada's second language. Plus, I had a few friends in Paris, so I wouldn't be entirely alone there. Money, though, was a problem. I didn't have family support. I won't get into why, that's personal, but let's just say I was on my own. I couldn't afford one of those expensive agencies, so I used a free au pair website instead. Not ideal, but it was all I could manage. That's how I connected with Leah. Leah's ad was warm and straightforward. She needed help with her 2 kids while her husband traveled for work. She seemed wonderful, very polite and very friendly. On our video calls, she was quick to call me Cherie and ma belle, which felt different from home but in a charming, motherly way. She asked a lot about me, how I was with kids, how I felt about family life, but didn't talk much about herself. Still, she felt genuine. I trusted her. The only thing that felt off was the kids. I asked to meet them on our calls more than once. Leah always had a reason why they couldn't join. One was napping, the other was at school, or they were on a playdate with a friend. She promised I'd meet them the second I arrived. It felt a little strange, but I figured I'd see them soon enough. Leah sent me a formal agreement. Everything looked proper, and we agreed on my start date. I booked my flight, packed my life into a suitcase, and said goodbye to Canada. When I landed at Charles de Gaulle, Leah wasn't there. That surprised me. From everything I had heard, most host families meet their au pairs at the airport. But then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Leah, telling me that she was stuck in traffic and instructed me to go to the side drop-off area where she'd have me picked up. I remember using Google Translate on her message because it sounded like she was going to have someone else pick me up, and I wanted to double-check. I was right, and that made me confused and a little unsettled. Despite that, I followed her instructions. A few minutes later, the car drove up, and a woman approached, late 40s maybe, with short blonde hair and a bright smile. She looked nothing like Leah. She introduced herself as Leah's cousin and said, "You must be Leah's au pair. She sent me to get you." I hesitated. Something felt off immediately. I asked her if I could talk to Leah and unlocked my phone. She told me that Leah was probably still driving and assured me that she'd be waiting for me at home. I called Leah anyway, and it went straight to voicemail. It didn't even ring. The woman kept telling me that I'd be fine with a huge smile on her face. I was confused but also exhausted from the flight. And what was I supposed to do? Stand there in the airport forever? so I did what she said and got in the car. The woman kept the conversation going non-stop as we drove. She asked about my flight, my life in Canada, and if I was excited to start my new job. But when I tried to steer the conversation back to Leah or the children, she brushed it off, just said that I'd love them and that I'd see them soon. I started to feel worse and worse about the whole situation. She was too polished, too eager to keep me talking without actually answering anything. The scenery outside began to change. I had the address in Google Maps, and the route we were taking didn't match. We were heading away from the suburbs and into what looked like an industrial-type area. I started panicking. I felt like I was in the process of being abducted. I asked her directly where we were going, and she responded lightly, calling it a shortcut, again repeating that Leah was expecting us. I felt the blood drain from my face. I knew at that point that she was lying. I told her to take me back to the airport, but she didn't answer. I told her I'd call the police if she didn't take me back to the airport, and she told me to relax. But I wasn't letting up. No matter what I said, she just kept repeating herself about Leah, and insisted that I was overreacting. The next time the car slowed down, I kicked the door open and jumped out onto the street. The woman didn't drive off. Instead, she kinda just looked at me like I was the one who was acting crazy. I called my mom, who told me to get away from the car, get somewhere safe, and call for help. As I was talking to my mom, I looked through the windshield and noticed the woman now on her phone, speaking rapidly in a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't French, and it definitely wasn't English. I couldn't shake the gut feeling that she was talking to Leah. There wasn't another car in sight, but under no circumstance was I getting back in that vehicle. Eventually, the driver's side door opened, and the woman took a step towards me. I screamed that I was on the phone with the police, and that actually got her to stop. Without saying another word, she went back to the car, threw my suitcase onto the road, and then sped off. I got the license plate as she drove away, but I was on the verge of tears with my mom still on the phone. I ended up hitchhiking to one of my friends' houses. I honestly don't know what I would have done without that option. My friend's family helped me report everything to the police, and eventually even agreed to help me with the fare back to Canada, which I was beyond grateful for. Eventually, they updated me on what the police informed them. Apparently, there was no registered au pair family by Leah's name. The number Leah used was prepaid and untraceable. All the photos of the children were taken from the internet. Everyone I talked to about this tells me the same thing. I was moments away from being trafficked. The worst part about that whole thing was that I wasted all that money on those plane tickets and traumatized myself permanently. Looking back, I know how lucky I am. I was moments away from something terrible, something I can barely let myself imagine. The whole situation was calculated from start to finish. If I hadn't trusted my gut, I might not be here to tell the story. It took some time, but I eventually made my way back to France, this time through a verified agency. I'm hoping to eventually fulfill residency requirements and become a permanent citizen here.